Today, I want to talk about the agendas and goals of certain Islamic extremist groups and Arab uh, extremist groups. And there are various groups over the last 40 years with the Arab liberation groups of the 1960s and 70s that have a far different agenda than the Islamist groups that we see today, which are much more nefarious. Um, and they all have one thing in common, uh, the notion of fighting against Western or secular imperialism, with Israel as being a factor for most of the aggression that we've seen over the long decades. Uh, Usually, most of these groups are used by the intelligence apparatuses, whether they be the Mukbarat, the General Intelligence Directorate of Saudi Arabia, or the long-standing Pakistan ISI, as well as the CIA, and as well as being circumvented by Israeli Arab uh, intelligence group called um, the Mr. Arvim, which is in a very elite covert Israeli unit where you have Arab Israelis who are Israeli by birthright and they live in Israel, who and as well as native Israelis who learned a language of their native Arabs, um, who look like them and live amongst them and become spies for uh, even as long as 20 years. And we'll talk about that during the course of this video. Um, and so the underlying message of most of these groups, whether they are of a political agenda or a Islamist agenda, building a caliphate around the world or building a caliphate in Arab governments, um, the message is clear: to defy Western imperialism. And it goes as far back as with the ideology of Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb, who I mentioned previously in the previous video, um, when he returned from the United States, saw that Western daily life was infiltrating Arab secular governments, and what he saw was wastefulness, uselessness regarding um, the monotone daily life of the Westerner. He saw that they wasted water on their grass, or that certain sports were brutal, like boxing. Um, he hated jazz; thought that was a useless form of music. But yet, he sympathized with the minority communities that were inside the United States, and he saw that the secular Western ideals were going to be the forefront for these secular Arab governments when uh, Pan Arabism was at the forefront during the 1940s and 50s. But that all changed after the Six-Day War, and so we saw these rise of these Arab organizations that were trying to fight back against the oppressors that they saw, which was the United States coalition, Great Britain, Canada, Germany, France, Australia, against the Arab world, the Ummah, which means the Arab world. Um, Politically active groups at one time, like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which was a Marxist-Leninist group headed by George Habash in 1967. The group was against the 1993 Declaration of Principles, participation in the Palestine Liberation Organization headed by Yasser Arafat. Um, the PFLP, as we'll call it for short, would participate in meetings with Arafat's Fatah party and PLO representatives in 1999 discuss things like national unity, but continued to oppose negotiations with Israel because Israel was currently oppressing the Palestinian peoples at this point under the Likud party headed by Benjamin Netanyahu. And this was a huge affront to the peaceful resolutions within the Arab community. And so we see this transfer of power between like Benjamin Netanyahu or Ariel Sharon or Ehud Barak, Likud right-wing nationalist party members who who knew that the United States government was their military might for global domination and subjugation of the Arab peoples in general. This way, Israel can condense its power within its own borders and slowly spread those borders to the Mediterranean, which is what Israel would like to do, have a small piece of land, not world domination, because they don't have the resources to do so, even though that they have an enormous nuclear arsenal, which isn't allowed to be vetted by any non-Israeli nuclear union. So there, we don't know how many bombs that they have. But you could see that with Israel, the United States, and the Arab world, we see this tension that was rising after the Six-Day War. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, headed by Ahmed Jibril in 1968, where they wanted to focus more on terrorist plots than political action because they saw that during the early 1960s and after the Six-Day War, talks were off the table. They wanted to gain back the land that was lost, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, who were humiliated. The Arab world was humiliated in this war. It was a really big turning event. The PFLP is violently opposed to the PLO and is closely tied to Syria and Iran. They've conducted multiple attacks throughout Europe and the Middle East during the 1970s and 80s, which is almost similar to another group, and also another group like the Abu Nidal organization, who I'll mention next. The PFLP is unique that it conducts terrorist operations against Israel using very unusual means, such as hot air balloons with bombs and motorized hang gliders. They focus on small-scale attacks in Israel, like the West Bank and Gaza Strip, to embattle the Israeli IDF. The Abu Nidal organization, headed by Sabri al-Banna, or his nom de guerre, Abu Nidal, who left the PLO in 1974. The Abu Nidal organization was much more violent. The PLO was much more apolitical. They wanted to work with Israeli government and also the secular Arab world, and also countries in South America, Central America, governments in Europe were basically emphatic toward the PLO. They started to see the plight of the Palestinian people. And the conspiracy is that the Abu Nidal organization, headed by Abu Nidal, Sabri al-Banna, basically was a splinter group, which they were, of Fatah. And so this group basically conducted terrorist operations where Fatah, headed by Yasser Arafat, did not. And Arafat always accused Abu Nidal as being a paid contractor for the United States and Israel to circumvent the peace deals between Palestine and the rest of the world in the plight of the ongoing Israeli aggression toward the Palestinians. The Abu Nidal organization conducted multiple terrorist attacks in 1985, which was the Rome-Vienna airport attacks, which was certainly a very unique attack. No one's ever seen anything like that before, where Abu Nidal members committed martyrdom operations. They threw grenades, shot at residents, customers inside the airports, waiting in line for tickets. One was an Israeli airline company. A lot of people were killed, including a number of the people that were involved in the terrorist operation. A number of other attacks, like the Nerv Shalom synagogue bombing in Istanbul, the Pan Am Flight 73 hijacking in Karachi in September of 1986, the City of Poros Day excursion ship attack in Greece in 1988, and the suspected assassination of PLO Deputy Chief Abu Iyad and PLO Security Chief Abu Hul in Tunis in January of 1991. These weren't religious groups. These aren't Islamist groups. These are more secular, apolitical organizations that had an agenda against Israeli aggression, against secular Arab governments, against secular governments in general, Western governments in general. And so their agendas were a lot different. They didn't want a caliphate, they didn't believe in one, and that wasn't their agenda. It wasn't until 1979 where we see this is the key year in which we see the rise of the Islamic fundamentalist groups. 1979 was a turning point in international terrorism, in which we saw the 1979 Soviet-Afghan War, the Iranian Revolution, and of course the 1980 mosque takeover by radical fundamentalists in Saudi Arabia. And so we see Islamist groups arise out of this period, which was slowly fermenting after these oppressive secular Arab nationalist nations. And of course, Saudi Arabia being the epicenter for Wahhabism, tens of $millions being poured into local madrasas of the very poor areas of these secular Arab nations. A lot of these secular countries had very oppressive regimes, which basically had a lot of revolts in these countries, such as Algeria, Egypt, North Africa. And of course, later on, Libya and Syria through the Arab Spring. But after these oppressive totalitarian governments, the poor regions, the poor areas, the working class basically wanted a new ideology to supplement this failed ideology, which allowed the Israelis to take advantage of the Six-Day War and saw secularism as a failed ideology, Pan-Arabism as a failed ideology. So the Islamist groups basically took over. Groups like the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which was an Egyptian group that's still active today, active since the late 1970s. It has two factions, one headed by Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is currently somewhere in Afghanistan, a key leader and associate to Osama bin Laden. Another group, the other group is the Vanguard to Conquest, headed by Ayman Hussein Aghizi, and of course, Abu al-Zamar, who was the leader of the original group called Al-Jihad, which later became Egyptian Islamic Jihad. The group's traditional goal is the overthrow of the Egyptian government, in which we saw later on in Muhammad Abdul al-Faraj's manuscript, in which he wanted to overthrow the Egyptian government, starting with the assassination of Anwar Sadat. But that failed because the Egyptian government basically drew back and arrested and tortured thousands of Egyptian Islamists, even people who were suspected to be involved with Islamists. That included Ayman al-Swahari, Omar Abdul Rahman, who is the nickname Blind Sheikh, and he's one of the leaders of the Gamma Islamiyah, which I'll get to in a minute. Khalid al-Islamboui, who is the main perpetrator of the assassination of Anwar Sadat, Muhammad ibn al-Faraj, Qasim Isam al-Kamari, dozens of others, Iman Sharif, who goes under Dr. Fadl. Another Islamist group is the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The PLI, I'll nickname them the PLI, is a Gazan Palestinian group. In the 1970s, they're apparently a series of loosely affiliated factions rather than a cohesive group. Their focus is the destruction of the Israeli Likud government, the Nationalist Zionist Party, the Likud Party, and the creation of the Palestinian Islamic State. This is a jihadist group supported by Saudi Arabia, and it's also getting support from Iran and Syria. Iran and Syria at this point were considered enemies by the State of Israel and the United States because they're headed by repressive regimes at some point. But of course, the United States and Israel has a long-standing history with Iran, going back to 1953, when the United States, using the CIA, helped to force a coup d'état against the Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, which gave Iran a new leadership under Reza Pahlavi, who went by the nickname the Shah of Iran, and he was actually a Western-backed puppet. That's all he was, implemented by the United States government. So the Palestinian Islamic Jihad basically carries out small bombings, crude homemade rockets to shoot at into Israeli territories. And what happens is the Israeli military will overreact on the reaction. Saul Alinsky had a great quote called that the real action is in the reaction of the enemy. And so that's what Israel basically does, is that they'll goad a reaction by the Palestinians whom they're oppressing. I don't need to tell you, you know what's going on there for decades. Bulldozing of Palestinian land. In replace, you have settler territories, Israeli-only territories. It's racist, it's oppressive, it's totalitarian. And of course, the human rights organizations all around the world, World Health Organization, the numerous organizations, a whole list, where they have basically said that Israel is causing human rights violations, and Israel ignores all of them. Why? Because they know that they won't be held responsible because they have the United States behind them, 100%. And so, what do the Palestinians do? Do they basically just lay down and die? Well, that's what the Israelis want. That's what the United States want, especially the Christian Zionists inside the United States. That's the biggest Zionist organization in the world, backed by which is the evangelical community, approximately 80 million people, and this causes a reaction by these Islamist groups that are being backed by Arab governments or Arab factions inside the governments. Another group is Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement. They have emerged from the Muslim Brotherhood during the first Palestinian Intifada in 1987, which incidentally has been supported by the Israeli IDF. The founder of Hamas is Ahmed Yassin, who basically is blind in one eye. He himself was against PLO. And so this group is basically was given funding in 1987, 1988. This has come out by the Israeli IDF later on. And so we see the Israelis giving support to Hamas because Hamas was basically anti-PLO. They were fighting against the PLO. They didn't want the PLO to represent them. And soon that Frankenstein monster turned against Israel itself. They're primarily anti-Israeli, and their opposition is against the occupied territories. That's the Gaza Strip and West Bank. And they're basically known to be the first group which uses suicide bombers. As an Islamist group, their strength is inside Gaza. And last but not least, of course, I'll mention the Gamma Islamiyah, which is the Egyptian militant group headed by numerous people like Omar Abdel Rahman and Zabud Amar and Refai Taha. This group is basically also against the Egyptian government. They want to see a Islamic caliphate within Egypt, following the works of Sayyid Qutb. And of course, Hassan al-Banna, who is the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, Al-Qaeda, at first, the refugee group, and basically formed out of an Arab camp called Al-Masada, headed by a young Saudi named Osama bin Laden, which was basically a training camp for Arabs because there weren't any Arab camps in Pakistan to fight in the Afghan-Soviet War. With the move into Sudan, Osama bin Laden took the members of the camp with him, and there they formed what they call Al-Qaeda, which is the base. Well, the base is basically not a database of names, as some conspiracy theorists have it. The base is basically Al-Masada. That's the base camp for Arabs. These Arabs were trained for guerrilla-type tactics in hopes of subverting the communist regime in Afghanistan, which after the Soviets left the country, went into two civil wars, which were much more bloodier than the 10-year war against the Soviets. And of course, the rise of the Taliban. The Taliban itself was formed by Mullah Omar, who was born in Pakistan. The Taliban is a regional group. They're ultra-orthodox, headed under the Hanbali school of thought, whereas Al-Qaeda is a little bit different. They're under the schools of Ibn Taymiyyah, much more radical in their sense for that their enemy is the far enemy. Now, the near enemy and far enemy idea originated from Sayyid Qutb, but it was much more popularized and implemented by Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri and Sharif Ayman al-Sharif, Iman Sharif, Dr. Fadl, who implemented a manuscript that was used for jihadist groups. The manuscript is called The Essentials of Making Ready for Jihad, or in the Arabic, Al-Umda fi al-Idad al-Uda. He has basically reneged on his previous ideology. He's actually still alive, but he's actually one of the founding members of Al Qaeda's top council. His jihad manual spread uh, throughout the underworld of most jihad organizations, including uh, the organizations that are still around today. Another group that I'll mention is the Armed Islamic Group. The Armed Islamic Group, which initiated terrorist activities in 1992 when the Algerians refused to accept a democratic elected government. The GIA is the Armed Islamic Group for short, has conducted mass killings of civilians, assassinations of Algerian leaders, led to one of the worst bloodbaths in the Algerian Civil War. There were two of them. They're still present. They're still present in certain areas of Algeria and in Yemen, but they don't target the United States directly. Other groups like the Jaysh-e-Muhammad, the Pakistan-based Jaysh-e-Muhammad, which is suspected to be a group created by the Pakistan ISI. It is headed by Maulana Masood Azhar, who is a ultra-fundamentalist from the Harakat al-Ansar, and he formed the group in February of 2000. The group's aim is to unite Kashmir with Pakistan. It is politically aligned with the more radical pro-Taliban group, the Jamaat-e-Ulema Islami. The Pakistani ISI is basically supporting this group, weapons, training, funding, against the Indian government, which is in possession of Kashmir. There's other numerous groups that came out later. The Islamic State, which was originally headed by Abu Musab al-Zarqadi, which was the Tal al-Wahad al-Jihad, later became the Islamic State in Iraq, and then later became the Islamic State and the Levant. Syrian Islamist groups popped out after the Syrian Arab Spring, al-Nusra Front, Ansar al-Sharia. I can name 25 others. These are all ultra-Wahhabist groups supported by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, the Gulf, and at some point the United States through a very covert operation called Timber Sycamore in 2011, operated by General David Petraeus, who was the former head of the CIA, the director of the CIA, in which they wanted to fund and train these groups using the CIA as the conduit, as well as the Mukhbarat, the Makbath intelligence group of Saudi Arabia, acting as the conduit for arms, weapon sales, in the hopes of supplanting Bashar al-Assad, who's the president of Syria, but it failed, and it ended in 2017 under U.S. President Donald Trump. What do a lot of these groups have in common? Well, a lot of these groups are basically fighting against imperialism, whether it be United States Western imperialism, which is what Al-Qaeda was against, which was what the Islamic State was against. Large groups that can basically attack Western U.S. or U.S. interests in the region or inside the United States. And were these provoked? Well, according to the FBI, during the Joint House Inquiry and through the Senate Select Committee of 2002, yes. These are precipitated attacks. The United States, through their coalition partners and with Israel, along with Saudi Arabia, headed by the kingdom, have created this atmosphere of extremism with their repressive imperialist ideology using the military as the conduit instead of conversation. When you have over 90 bases around the world, most of them in the Middle East. And of course, I don't need to tell you the illegal war of Iraq in response to the September 11, 2001 attacks, which were based on false intelligence reports by the CIA, by the State Department, in which Secretary of State Colin Powell was used as a face, a friendly face for the United Nations Security Council to go to war against Iraq because they were procuring weapons of mass destruction. Where did they get information from? They got it from the torture of Sheikh Ibn al-Libi. Al-Libi was tortured, and he basically told his torturers whatever they wanted to hear. This is for the public record. The war was approved, and as of this date, we think the number is anywhere between 1.5 million to 2 million people that were killed in the Iraq war. Over 15,000 are killed in Afghanistan with the drone bombings that we conduct there through third-hand information from jealous clerics or tribal leaders that wanted to take out an adversary in the region. Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib prison, where we tortured these people, imprisoned people who have no connections to terrorism, no connections to terrorist organizations. These are Pashtun farmers. Where it came out later through the inquiry into Abu Ghraib, which was a disaster. Do I need to show you the photographs? You can look them up, Abu Ghraib prison photographs. It caused a reaction from these terrorist groups. The continued supplanting or trying to supplant Arab governments, democratically elected Arab governments. We're seeing that in Syria, in which we have helped, and I mentioned Timber Sycamore, where the United States, who supposedly is fighting a war on terror, is supporting the terrorists in the region for 6 years, giving them logistical and funding, logistical support to help overthrow Bashar al-Assad, who, along with Turkey and Russia, are trying to fight against the Islamists in the country. So they're basically fighting the war on terror. What about our U.S. soldiers who are being used, lied to by their own government? Libya, which was a war that Obama didn't approve of at first, but was pressured by Hillary Rodham Clinton, Stephanie Powers, Susan Rice, who persuaded Obama to go ahead and support the Islamists in that country, in which they did overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, saying that we've killed the real terrorist in the country. Meanwhile, now that country is in sectarian violence and has open air slave markets. Yay for democracy. So you can see that anything the United States does in the Middle East, now I'm not talking about anywhere else, it's like Central America, which was another disaster of the 1970s and 80s. I'm talking about the Middle East here, in which the action is in the reaction, as Saul Alinsky once said, and as I said, quote him earlier. We are creating the reaction of the alleged enemy. Well, the United States is the enemy in the region through their action. But because of that action, they're goading a reaction in which they hope would arise so that they continue to fight this war on terror, just like the war on drugs, where it's the CIA who are the biggest drug dealers on planet Earth. Is that the reason why we're in Afghanistan, in the Helmand province in the first place, which is the second largest import of opium outside the Golden Triangle. So these groups that we see today, groups in which we helped fund in 1979 through numerous Mujahideen factions, headed by the Haqqani network under Jalaluddin Haqqani. That group is still alive today, which was a major organization and a major influence for jihadist groups in the future. Jaysh-e-Muhammad, created by the Pakistan ISI to fight against the Indian government, in which, of course, the Frankenstein monster comes back to bite you in the rear because they do terrorist acts against the Pakistan government. Same thing for the Islamic State. Their ideology, Wahhabi Islam, Salafi Islam, created by Saudi Arabia. Well, ISIL has bombed the kingdom before. And of course, Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who conducted the far enemy, which is the United States and Israel. We could have wiped out Al-Qaeda in the Sudan using CIA operative Billy Waugh, who once said that he could have assassinated Osama bin Laden because he basically was monitoring bin Laden's footsteps. This was denied under George Bush, and later on Bill Clinton, who basically didn't want to assassinate bin Laden either, when George Tenet, who was appointed director of the CIA in 1996, and operated a plan to capture or assassinate bin Laden, which was actually called the Plan, where they wanted to build listening stations all around Afghanistan, basically surround Tora Bora and try to get as close to bin Laden as possible, where they could rendition him and bring him to the United States, which there was a warrant for his arrest. By the way, the only active warrant that was actually the first warrant was Muammar Gaddafi, who actually put a warrant out for the arrest of bin Laden first, before the United States. Patrick Fitzgerald, U.S. attorney, U.S. prosecutor out of Chicago, who basically tried to prosecute bin Laden for his involvement in the 1998 East Africa bombings. And of course, I don't have to tell you, because I've said it before in previous videos, the intelligence apparatuses like the CIA, the NSA, who basically were monitoring Al-Qaeda years prior in advance, many years prior to the 9/11 attacks. It's basically one giant circle. The United States actually, through their repressive, militant, imperialist ideologies, who are in support of the Zionist, Likud, brutal oppression of the Palestinian people, and of course the global war against terror, which is basically a war against Islam, which is exactly what bin Laden once said in an interview, that, in a speech that he gave in 2001, which was aired by Al Jazeera. I can't show you the clips because YouTube actually thinks that I'm promoting terrorism. Ramzi Youssef, in his sentencing for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and for the Pachinko plot, which was a terrorist plot to bomb 12 airliners and to use one plane to crash into the CIA Langley, using Abdul Hakim Murad as the martyrdom pilot, basically said that the United States is where we learn terrorism from, and that it's the United States whose terrorism policies have created the atmosphere for terrorist cells to engage the United States on its oppressive policies in the Islamic world. Now, I'm not giving any leeway here to Osama bin Laden. I'm not affiliating or supporting anything they've done. Osama bin Laden, Ramzi Youssef, Abu Musab al Zarqawi, these are murderers. Everybody who was involved with the 9/11 attacks by hijacking those planes and crashing them into the World Trade Center, Pentagon, and Shanksville, killing civilians, they're killers, they're murderers. These are people who go by the hadiths of Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Hanbal school of thought, the real radical schools of thought. But they have a message. And that message is basically that they don't hate us because we're secularist, because our women wear short skirts, or because we enjoy baseball games, or that we enjoy boxing, or that we're a Christian nation. The message is clear in their statements that they've made in the last 25 years. The statements against the oppressive policies of the U.S. government.